Good morning, Grace Church. I am not Pastor Brad. There's three things I have in common with Brad. Okay. One, I'm a guy. I'm a male. Two, I have a beard. Brad's has quite a few more years of length on mine, though. And third, we went to the same college, but many years apart. And so I have the amazing privilege to be able to speak with everyone here today. I last gave a sermon about a year ago, actually, from this week, which is kind of odd timing, maybe intentional. I don't know. And I have been chosen to be speaking on one of the many people in the Bible in our Adventurers series. So as we get started, I wanted to give a quick introduction on kind of what we've been talking about overall throughout this series. So last week we had our Youth Sunday, and so that can kind of make things a little bit, oh, we missed a regular Sunday service. I don't know what we're talking about anymore. I'm also a victim of that. But that's also because I was also in BBS, and so I had the surprise song stuck in my head on repeat for about. Actually, I still have it on repeat, so we're good. So over the sermon series, we've been talking about what is faith, and more specifically, kind of looking at different stories throughout Scripture and how different people within the Bible have demonstrated faith in God, faithfulness in following Him, and all the challenges that these individuals have faced. And ultimately how these actions have not only impacted their own lives in that time, but also the course of the Jewish people and of Israel, of the whole narrative of the Bible, as well as the beginnings of the Christian faith as well. So before we start on today's adventurer, I do want to give a short recap on the previous weeks, since again, we had a gap Sunday, and I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So on our first week, we had what Brad quickly called the dingleberry of the Bible, which is Abraham. And on Abraham, it was talking about how faith follows God into the unknown. And also, I really hope Maya does not clip that for me and put it on Facebook. Week after that, we talked about Ruth. And Ruth, in the message that we did, it was like God can redeem paths we would never choose. And we ended that message with God restoring what is broken. After that, we had Larry speak on Peter, and we talked about how God can work through brokenness and failure, and looked at the story of Peter in the early church. And then the last one we had was on Joseph, and this was going through how trusting God can work and help work us through any trial, and that God works faithfully. The God who works faithfully is worth following as well. So who are we speaking on today? So out of all of the people in the Bible, there's a lot, especially if you go through the genealogies. What would be a good one for me to talk about? No, I'm a 6'3" bearded man. Would it be Micah, Joshua, Moses specifically because of the beard? Maybe Paul? No, Esther made the most sense. And actually, if I remember correctly, I actually chose Esther. And the reason why is because I think that the book of Esther is one of the most interesting books of the Bible. And it's actually for some of the reasons, which we'll go into a little bit later, that actually some people probably don't like the book of Esther. But there are so many good themes throughout this narrative and the story. Ones that honestly could take up a whole sermon series, a multi-weeks long. But I have approximately probably 40 minutes to talk with it, probably a little bit less. And so one of the things I want to talk about today is also how this can be applied today. So over the last few weeks, we've been providing a summary of these different books and stories. And today's message is going to be a slightly different flow, different perspective, because I'm not Brad or Larry, and I preach a little differently sometimes. And Brad did not check this sermon before I started speaking today. So you can blame him if it's anything that isn't good. And also, so what I'm going to start with today, I'm not going to be playing the videos we've been playing for the last few weeks. I'm going to be giving a brief summarization with a few surprises sprinkled in. So, in talking about the book of Esther, this is set in the Persian Empire during the reign of King Asterius, or Xerxes. I'm going to say King Xerxes because that's more fun to say, but in the ESV translation, it is Asterius. Xerxes is NIV. Same person. So this tells about how a Jewish woman becomes queen and saves her people from annihilation. If you're looking at the Bible as a whole, this takes place after the Jewish exile and takes place roughly 400s BC. And so the story opens up when King Xerxes, ruling from Susa over 127 provinces, holds a lavish banquet. And during this feast, while heavily intoxicated, he summons his queen to display her beauty, but she refuses. And in this moment, he is humiliated and is advised that by his eunuchs and his other councilmen and people that this defiance could inspire disobedience among all of the empire's wives and all the women in the kingdom. And so the king deposes her and orders a search for a new queen. And so beautiful young women are gathered from across the empire, and among them is a woman by the name of Hadassah or Esther. And this is a Jewish orphan who was raised by her cousin Mordecai. And so one of the things we see throughout the story is that Mordecai tells Esther to hide her Jewish identity. And then ultimately, the king ends up favoring Esther above all the other women that were collected and makes her queen. And meanwhile, Mordecai overhears a plot to assassinate the king and reports it through Esther, saving the king's life. And this deed is recorded in the Royal Chronicles. Now, we don't know what this really looks like. We have a text description, but we don't have videos. We don't have things that were showing this broadcasted event. But we can imagine it went a little bit like this.
Hey, who's this guy?
I am the royal chef.
I've never seen you.
I'm new.
He made me a cake. Psst, isn't that nice?
Did you invite him?
Well, no.
Did you tell him what can happen to someone who appears before you uninvited?
Well, no. I was too busy thinking about that cake. Doesn't it look yummy?
Stop! It's a trap!
Why is there a piano on my cake?
Seize them! Hey, aren't you the Peony brothers? The most wanted peas in Persia?
That's right, we are.
And we could have taken over the kingdom if it wasn't for that meddling queen.
You saved my life.
Well, actually, Your Highness, it was the good guard Mordecai. He alerted me. It was Mordecai who saved your life.
Oh, well, Mordecai,
King! What should the punishment be for these two dangerous criminals? The most wanted peas in Persia who appeared before you uninvited and tried to drop a piano on your head.
Well, let's see. It should probably be pretty stiff, huh? What do you think?
I say the punishment should be banishment to the island of perpetual tickling.
You don't mean
The island where you are tickled day and night
night and day!
without stop.
Not even if you say pretty please!
There are two things you don't do in Persia. One of them is trying to drop a piano on a king's head. The other is appearing before him uninvited. The Peony brothers found these things out the hard way.
All right, so while this is a little bit of a humorous interpretation of what that event might have looked like, in this clip we actually made a really important character, which is the character of Haman, or the villain of the story. So after Mordecai uncovers the plot on King Xerxes' life, Haman is actually elevated to one of the highest positions in the empire and a very trusted advisor to the king. And throughout this position, he uses this to kind of make people kind of worship him and wanted everyone to bow before him. However, Mordecai refused. And because of this, Haman was enraged. And after learning that Mordecai belonged to the Jewish people, Haman resolves to destroy not only him, but all the Jews throughout the empire. He casts lots to choose a date and persuades the king to issue an irreversible decree ordering the extermination of the Jews and promising a huge sum to the royal treasury. Mordecai mourns and urges Esther to plead with the king, warning her that she will not escape simply because she is in the palace, and adding that perhaps she has come to royalty for such a time as this. Esther approaches the king, who welcomes her, allows her to be in his presence, and she invites him and Haman to a series of banquets. Haman was in good spirits after being invited to Esther's banquet until he saw Mordecai at the gates. Mordecai would not honor or fear him, and this angered Haman even more. So he asked some of his wife and his trusted friends what he should do about it, and they suggested that he should build gallows for Mordecai and asked the king in the morning to send Mordecai to the island of perpetual tickling, death. So Haman had the gallows built. So that night, unable to sleep, the king reads the Chronicles and discovers Mordecai's unrewarded loyalty. He asks Haman how he should honor a man that the king delights in, and Haman, being the selfish villain, assuming it's himself, describes elaborate honors and things to celebrate him, but then is forced to dispo them onto Mordecai. And then at Esther's second banquet, this is where she reveals her Jewish identity and exposes Haman as the enemy plotting her people's destruction. And then something really interesting happens to Haman.
You had me banish the man who saved my life and my own queen? For your punishment, Haman, you ought to be sent to the island of perpetual tickling along with anyone else who dares scheme against my queen and her family.
So Haman got what was coming to him.
All right, so the furious king orders Haman hanged on the very gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. And so during the time, because the king issued a decree, it could not be reversed. And so the king authorizes a new one, allowing the Jews to defend themselves against this attack. So on this day, the Jews actually overcome their enemies. Mordecai rises to high office. And then to commemorate their deliverance, Mordecai and Esther establish a festival, and they celebrate feasting, gift giving, etc., etc. Happy ending. So, in looking over the book of Esther today, I don't want to necessarily focus on the book as a whole, because there are a lot of good themes that we could talk about today. And as I already mentioned, literally there's sermon series out there, there's whole studies out there just on the book of Esther and all of the different aspects and different contexts and different historical narratives and people, et cetera, et cetera. However, I would like to discuss Esther as a person, a woman who is an unlikely queen, who is an adventurer in this series. And I want to take a look at the trials that she went through in her faith, her loyalty, and helping her people. Another reason that this book is one of the most unique books in the Bible, it is one of the very few places in the Bible that does not mention God by name at all. Does not mention Lord, Yahweh, God, any interpretation of that. This is a book that is absent of that. However, that does not mean that God isn't present. And I think it's actually one of the best books because of that. Because if we want to take a look at applications and how we can live in a world and apply situations where maybe sometimes we don't always know or think that God isn't directly speaking to us through a prophet. Or sometimes it can feel at times that God isn't with us, even though he is. There isn't a direct mention. It's showing that even in the midst of various circumstances, God is with us and guides our lives. So while I'm going to talk about a few different lessons on faith we can take from Esther's life, I first want to focus on the big idea for today's sermon. And that is that God calls us to use every circumstance of our lives, even the ones we didn't choose, for the good of others. God calls us to use every circumstance of our lives, even the ones we didn't choose, for the good of others. As we dive into the story of Esther, we'll find that there were many places where she didn't get a choice or she was afraid. And that didn't stop her from saving the Jewish people from the Persian Empire and from potential extermination. So this actually brings me to the first point for today's message as well. And that is that God calls us to be faithful where he has placed us. God calls us to be faithful where he has placed us. So in the book of Esther, there's a little over 160 verses, and only about 100 of them have absolutely nothing to do with Esther herself as a person. They give context to the story, to the king, to Haman, to Mordecai, to the Jewish people. So from what little we do know about her, and the only 40% that actually does deal with her, we actually have a lot we can take a look at. And we can see that actually she did not have much control over the circumstances of her life. Esther did not choose many of these circumstances that ultimately led to the decision in this book for her to make the choice to save the Jewish people. So first off, Esther was an orphan. After her father and mother died, she was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who treated her as his own daughter. And specifically, this was something that at the time, it was common, but for an orphan to actually be raised and actually treated with the same dignity and respect that someone who had parents had was rare. And there's a really good interpretation of seeing that Mordecai actually took the mantle, actually stepped up to take care of a member of his family. Another thing, so she was an orphan. She didn't choose that. She didn't choose to be raised by Mordecai. She also didn't choose her looks. So in chapter 2, verse 7 of Esther, it says that Esther was very beautiful. The ESV version says the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. So that's something that wasn't by choice, especially going to the ancient Persian Empire. There wasn't makeup. There wasn't things to make yourself look better. There wasn't haircut, probably was haircuts, but there wasn't things that we in 21st century have today. The next thing is that she was taken to the palace. So when King Xerxes orders for all the young virgins in the territory to be gathered, Esther was among those taken. She spent, also during this time, 12 months, give or take, doing beauty treatments that involved many, many different things and many different rituals before ultimately being forced to spend the night with the king. And the last thing is that she was made queen. The queen was so pleased with Esther when he summoned her that he made her the queen of the empire. Was immediately captured by her beauty, and that she was his favorite of all of the people in his harem. So from what we can see, Esther didn't make a lot of her own choices. She was never given a choice in things such as her parents, her looks, or frankly, even if she wanted to become queen. But as we'll see later, even though Esther never chose to be put into the positions that she was faithful to God's calling in her life. And at this point, you might be thinking, it was really easy for Esther to be faithful. She was the queen. She had the money, she had the title, she had the respect of the people, most likely. She had access to the king. And if I was put in that position, it'd be so easy to be faithful to God. It'd be so easy. I could I'd be the perfect Christian if I had all this money and all this power and all this status. It's really easy to romanticize Esther's story because we know how it ends. We know that it works out. for the Jewish people. We know that it works out for her. We picture a queen wearing a crown in a royal palace with a big old scepter on a throne and all the privileges that it entails. But I want to point out something very, very important. She wasn't living in a fairy tale. The harsh and brutal realities of the Persian Empire wasn't a Disney movie. It wasn't a fairy tale book. It wasn't a romanticized tale you tell your children to go to sleep where she fell in love with Prince Charming and everything happily ever after. The harsh realities of this Persian Empire were something entirely different. So throughout the book of Esther, we can see that women were also, honestly, treated like possessions. They were not treated as human beings with their own minds, thoughts, feelings, but they were just something to take. The king just took all the women in the city that were virgins. He didn't ask the permission, he took them. And this is very clear by seeing as well that the beginning of the book starts with the queen saying no to him, after he requested that she present herself to him during a drunken celebration with all of his buddies. Because she refused to listen to the king, she was banished from his presence. And these noblemen, feeling that other women would be rebellious, set out this royal edict that basically every man needs to rule their household, and that women can't say no to their husbands out of respect. So right away, we can see that women are not given autonomy over their own choices. They are forced to listen to the men around them, and even if they don't, the punishment is severe. I can tell you for a fact, and I'm going to say this, that if I'm in a drunken stupor and I ask my wife, Maya, who's our lovely office manager, look at how great my wife is to all my buddies and friends, she's going to say no. And she's going to say, you're being stupid and you're being sinful by doing that. And that isn't a lack of respect of her telling me no. That's me sinning against her because I'm trying to parade around like an object, not as a person. And that shows that I don't either respect or love her. I can say that because our grandma's sitting in the room now. She's like, oh, how nice. So moving on. The king then took advice of one of his personal attendants to gather all the young, beautiful virgins in the territory to find the one that pleases him the most. And this is where Esther comes in. Esther was not invited to the palace. She was taken. The Bible mentions that multiple times, that the women were taken. She was separated from her home, her family. She could still talk to Mordecai at the gates and things like that. And everything that was kind of familiar. And he doesn't talk about her friends or other family relationships or things like that. Doesn't mention that. But she was taken from that. And after 12 months of these beauty treatments, she was expected to spend one night with a man that she had not chosen, knowing that if he was not pleased, she would spend the rest of her life confined to the other harem, the other king's harem, where basically if you didn't please the king at that time, you're just shoved off in this little other area, never to be talked to again. And oftentimes, skip the slide there. And oftentimes, what happens with this is that they also did not have the freedom to leave. So once you're in this other harem, you were kind of still the king's possession, but you couldn't really remarry. You're protected by the eunuchs, and you kind of just lived in the palace, which sounds kind of nice, but still wasn't the life that she could have been living. And to put it in today's terms, and I apologize, it's going to probably get a little graphic here. This is what human trafficking looks like. When you just take a woman, you put her somewhere, you prep them up, and they have sex with a man that they don't know, didn't agree with. So honestly, she was trafficked for sexual pleasure, was most likely sexual assaulted along with a lot of these other women there because they didn't have a choice. And from everything we see, Esther had no power to say no. If the king chose whatever day, she couldn't say no. There wasn't a choice that was given to her. King Xerxes had absolute power over the situation within his kingdom because he was the king. And even when Esther found favor with the king, she was only allowed to see him when he called for her, when he wanted something from her. Most of the time, it's probably sex. And that involved everyone as well. No one could approach the king, but that was his wife. You would think, he would do a little bit more for that. So I think it's really important when we're talking about the book of Esther to talk about the realities of the situation in the Persian Empire, in the ancient world, that oftentimes get glossed over in this story about Esther. We don't talk about the harsh realities that women faced. And so I think it's really easy to see the courage Esther presented later in the book and forget what it cost her personally, morally, physically, spiritually to get there. And throughout the Bible, we also see, so this is, if you take this context, this is a pretty horrific situation. I think anyone can agree if someone is made to make choices like that without their consent, that's not good. If you think that is good, please see me after the service. But that doesn't mean that God cannot use these horrific situations to bring redemption out of these things. And Esther's story is no exception to that. So going back to the first point, God calls us to be faithful where he has placed us. Esther's faithfulness was not demonstrated because her position was desirable. It was demonstrated because in the middle of an unjust and painful situation, she remained willing to be used by God to help the Jewish people. She could not control where she'd been placed or the actions of those around her, but she could control whether she would trust God, trust Mordecai, trust the people that raised her in the midst of these circumstances that she found herself in. So for a few years after she was made queen, Esther faithfully lived in these circumstances. She never would have chosen, but then everything's changed. Haman, the guy who sought to the island of perpetual tickling. Haman's decree meant that her own people that she grew up in faced total annihilation. Because the Persian Empire versus Israel's in the kingdom greatly outweighed the other. And so suddenly her position wasn't just something she had to endure. It became something that God intended to use. And that is where we discover our next point. And that is that true courage acts wisely even when afraid. True courage acts wisely even when afraid. Oftentimes we mistake courage for fearlessness, but that isn't accurate. Courage is the decision that something else is more important than the fear you're feeling. It means that we choose to obey God even when that fear is real. It's scary. It is facing you head on. Esther had every reason to fear. Think back to the queen. All she said was say no one time, and she was replaced and banished. And honestly, some also scholars aren't really sure what happened to her. She might have been killed. She might have just been stripped of the titles. There's a lot of different, the book of Esther doesn't directly say. So when Esther told Mordecai in chapter 4, verse 16, if I perish, I perish, she was not being a dramatic teenager saying this. This isn't saying, oh, I guess that if it's my time, it's my time. I say that a lot out of jest to my wife, out of the most inconveniencing things like, oh, if this kills me, I guess it's fine. This isn't what this is saying here. During this time, if anyone went to the king without being called, they were put to death unless he held out his golden scepter. And that was, the king had to find favor with you. And this didn't happen often. And that golden scepter, if he did not do that, that was you're killed, you're executed. And we can see that Esther and Mordecai go back and forth in chapter 4. And after Mordecai commanded she go to the king and plead for his favor, Esther informs them hey, this is the law. If I do this, I could die. And the king does not allow this. It isn't until after Mordecai reminds her that this might be the reason she's in the palace to begin with, that she agrees to break the law and go in front of the king. Later, if you go to chapter 7, where she actually tells the king what she wants, she even admits that she would not have gone to the king if her people were sold into slavery. She went to the king specifically because they were going to be killed. And that's what made her decide to go to him. So Esther very well could have lost everything she had, including her life, if things did not go the way that God wanted them to be. But even through her fear, she didn't act impulsively. When we think of courage, we often imagine someone making a split-second emotional decision, charging that hill, taking that stand, saying that thing that you want to say to someone in that moment. But that's not what we see here in Esther at all. Her courage was not reckless. That's a hard word to say. It was wise. Even though Esther agrees to go to the king, she doesn't immediately run to the throne and say, King, I need you to do this for me. My people are going to be harmed. She doesn't do that. What she does is what we see in Esther 4:16. Is that she asks, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold going back a little bit. What she does is that she responds to Mordecai and says, go gather all of the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, nights, or day. I and my young woman will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king. So before Esther even approached the king in this situation, she first fasted, probably prayed about it. It doesn't say that, but I'm going to assume she might have prayed about it. Other Jewish people prayed about it probably. She recognized that the situation was bigger than herself, so that she asked the support of the Jewish community, of the women that were attending with her, and she sought this community as well as God's help. She understood that courage is not found in self-confidence, but in trusted community, in guidance, trusting God, and deliverance. So, as we notice in the beginning of Esther 5, this is when she actually approaches the king. So notice what we see. So it starts off with, in verse 1, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther that golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. After the 3 days of fasting were complete, Esther put on these royal robes and stood in the inner court. Did she go yelling, screaming, cursing, saying, this is what you're going to do to my people. This is this edict that you put out? No. Did she enter a full panic, fear, and blurt out and say, King, I need this to be done? No. She waited and waited until the king saw her, and then he extended his golden scepter. She approached him with respect. She approached him with the way that she knew the king wanted to be approached. Continuing in verse 3. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. Even then, the king literally offered her half of his kingdom, which again, King Xerxes is a little bit of a drama queen too. But she didn't reveal Haman's plot. She didn't say, hey, I need right now, this Haman's doing this thing and my people are going to be destroyed. I'm at risk. She didn't do that. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet. She was being strategic. And later in chapter 5, while the king and Haman are at the first feast, the king asks Esther again what she would like, and she still doesn't mention her request. Instead, she invites him to a second banquet where she eventually will tell the king what she wants. But why? And why did she approach it this way when she could have very easily said, hey, this is exactly what the problem is. This is what I need from you. You have the power in this empire to do this. Why did she do that? And that's because courage and wisdom often go together. Esther understood that doing the right thing is not the same as acting impulsively out of fear. She was patient. She was thoughtful. She trusted God's timing and protection for her and the Jewish people. And she knew that acting with courage means being wise even when afraid. Sometimes we think faith means acting as quickly as possible, but scripture often shows us something different. Faith seeks God and waits on his timing and acts with wisdom. Esther teaches us that true courage is not reckless confidence. It is patient obedience that trusts God enough to move forward, even when the outcome is uncertain. Esther's courage wasn't courageous just because she risked her life. People take risks every day for all types of reasons. I could choose to walk across the street in the middle of a highway. That's a risky decision. It's a stupid one, though. What made Esther's courage extraordinary was who she was risking her life for at this time. And that brings me to my third point. God calls us to stand for the vulnerable. God calls us to stand for the vulnerable. He doesn't give us influence, power, or privilege simply for our own benefit. He calls us to use what he has entrusted to us for the sake of others, especially those who are vulnerable, overlooked, and unable to defend themselves. So I want to take a quick look back at Esther 4. I apologize, I'm jumping around a little bit. But we see when Esther and Mordecai are having their back and forth conversation, Mordecai replies Esther with this. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, a relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." At this point in the story, no one besides Mordecai and probably people that she knew beforehand knew that she was Jewish. No one in the king's court knew that. And because Mordecai told her to keep that a secret. So when this royal decree goes out, she isn't in any harm's way. King doesn't say, "Oh, I know you're Jewish, so I'm going to go kill you." Doesn't know that. And the king kind of comes across a little bit as a bumbling buffoon a little bit. But if she wanted to, because she wasn't in harm's way, she could just sit back, not worry about anything. It's not her problem. It's not her. She's not Jewish. She's Persian. She's the Persian queen. But Mordecai reminds her that even if she stays silent, she will not come out of this unscathed. And now the Bible doesn't say directly if Mordecai meant emotionally, physically, probably physically, but I think we can assume it was both to a degree. Mordecai understood that staying silent would not actually guarantee Esther's safety. If her heritage was revealed, her position of queen would not have been able to save her because the king's decree was irreversible. Also, she chose to stay silent and was physically unaffected for whatever reason. She would still have to live with the knowledge, potentially, of thousands, hundreds, tens of thousands of Jewish people dead because she chose not to act. And she could have done something to help protect these people, but she didn't. And this shows that faith refuses to remain silent in the faith of injustice. This is a difficult truth for us to wrestle with. Sometimes we believe that if an injustice does not directly affect us, we can remain uninvolved. We convince ourselves that staying silent protects our peace, our reputation, or our comfort. But Mordecai reminds Esther that silence does not remove us from the reality of what is happening around us. It only means that we have chosen not to respond. God blesses us that we are able to serve those around us, not simply protect our own skin, our own hide. As followers of God and believers in Jesus Christ, we are not only called to care about injustice when it affects us personally or when it affects the people who are most like us. Because every person is made in the image of God, and the suffering of others should matter to us. Faith does not ask, do they share the color of my skin? Do I speak the same language as them? Do we believe the same exact thing? Instead, faith asks, how can I love my neighbor as God has called me to do? My answer to that is that faith acts for the good of others, even at personal cost. As you saw earlier, Esther didn't use her position as queen to save herself from being harmed. Instead, she put herself in harm's way, risking everything to save others. And this is where Esther stands in contrast with others who had powerful positions in this story. King Xerxes had the ultimate power. He was the most influential person in this area, but he used it to serve himself. He would celebrate and have these lavish parties and things like that, but ultimately he was a very selfish man. He allowed others as well to make decisions for him, like Haman, and avoided taking any responsibility for those consequences. Haman had this ability because of his position that the king put him in, to sway the king, and he used it to satisfy his own pride and anger. So when Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman, Haman used his influence to order the murder of a whole nation of people that were in this region. His power became a tool of harm and destruction. But when Esther was given power, she uses it to protect people who had no power of their own in this area. Remember, this is when the Jews returned to Israel. They were separated from the actual nation. She was willing to risk her position and her life because she understood that God had placed her there for a purpose. So Esther's story challenges us to evaluate the way we think about injustices today. It is easy to believe that if we are not the one causing harm, then we have done our part. I didn't do that, so it's not my problem. But Mordecai's words to Esther shows us that faithfulness requires more than simply avoiding evil or doing evil things. There are moments when God calls his people to respond to those suffering around him. Esther could have easily decided to not do anything in favor of staying safe. And Mordecai reminded her that she had a responsibility because God placed her in a position where she could act. The same is true for us. We do not get to measure our faithfulness by only asking, am I personally causing injustice? We also have to ask, am I willing to do something when I see others being harmed? There are people around us who are experiencing real suffering, real injustices, and real vulnerability. Something they're suffering of because of poverty, racism, abuse, exploitation, loneliness, or just honestly being ignored, slipping through the cracks of society's fingers by those who have the ability to help. As a follower of Jesus Christ, we cannot simply look away because the problem is uncomfortable. It doesn't affect us personally, or speaking up could put us at risk. Silence may feel safe, but Esther reminds us that faith is not measured by how well we protect our own comfort. Faith is measured by our willingness to trust God enough to love our neighbor, even when it costs us something or everything. Take a look at history. There are many cases where people have done this, when there's been grave injustices across the world. Things like slavery in the United States, people running the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape to the north. They could have been killed for that, shot for that. They're stealing property. Wasn't right at all. But those people are the only saving grace that some of those slaves had. Look at World War II. Holocaust, or easy example, where over 6 million people got killed, and then many thousands of people helped different populations in Europe. A lot of people stood by and stayed silent. And so while some of these are dramatic examples, this shows that this isn't something novel or new for us to stand up for the vulnerable. A lot of those groups that were helping that time were Christians. And this shows that God has always wanted us to do this, even at the risk of death or harm to ourselves. So as we come to the end of Esther's story, we need to remember that Esther's courage was not just about one woman making one brave decision. Esther's story reveals the heart of God and what he has for our lives. Throughout Scripture, we see that also that God cares deeply about those who are vulnerable. those who are overlooked, and those who are suffering. Some quick other examples of this. Micah 6:8, Micah prophet summarizes what God desires from his people: to do justice, love, kindness, and walk humbly with God. Notice that God does not call his people to believe all the right things or be perfect, fearless people. Instead, he calls us to live faithfully and to walk with him in a way that changes how we treat the people around us. Jeremiah 22:3 gives a similar command. Thus says the Lord, do justice and righteousness, deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed, do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place. God's people have always been called to care about what happens to others, especially those who are being mistreated or do not have a power to defend themselves. Ending with Proverbs 31:8-9. It says, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. The wisdom of Scripture reminds us that sometimes faithfulness requires us to use our voice for those who do not have one. This is exactly what Esther did. She could not control the circumstances that she was put in. She could not control the decree that had been made to her people. She could not control the king's heart. And she could not control Haman's actions. But she could decide whether she would use the position that God had given her to serve others, to save people, to speak out for the vulnerable. So, what does that mean for everyone in here today? You have to do something. You got it, Martin. And the music team can come back up now. So, one of the first things I want to say is we need to trust God where we are. Esther did not choose her circumstances, but she trusted that God had placed her there for a purpose. I want you to ask yourself, am I faithfully following God in the palace that he put me? Or am I constantly waiting for a different situation before I obey? It can be so easy to constantly want a little change to happen or something different to come along before we're comfortable with trusting and listening to what God has for us. But I implore you to challenge that in your heart, if that's you, and to really trust God and not wait for this one small thing to change before you do something. Next, I want you to act wisely, even if you're afraid. Esther was afraid, and fear did not have the final say. She sought God, acted wisely, and stepped forward in obedience. Ask yourself, what is God asking me to do that I have been avoiding because I'm afraid? And how can I approach it wisely? Lastly, use what God has given you to serve others. Esther used her position, her access, and influence to protect people who could not protect themselves. Ask yourself, who has God placed around me that I have the ability to help? This can be seeing how you can help other organizations in our community. Like a good example is Project Restoration that our church is connected to, helping the unhoused population in Ephrata. There's Ephrata Social Services. There's a lot of other nonprofits in the area that do good things for the community. Our own church does things. Maybe it's not volunteering. Maybe it's simply talking to the neighbor you never talked to, or maybe the neighbor that is different from you, the neighbor that annoys you, or maybe it's talking to that person you fell out with years ago. We need to ask others, how can we serve you today? And what can we do for you? That is a mindset that is often lost in our church today. So with that, that's kind of my summary on character of Esther. Hope you guys will be able to get something from that today, and be able to challenge you with those things today. So I'm going to pray for us. Dear God, I just want to thank you for allowing us, giving us the heart and the ability to be bold in our decision making, allowing us to know that no matter what the circumstances of our lives, we are in this place for a purpose. Everything we have gone through, everything we have done has led us to this point in time right here, right now. And through that, we can either choose to be bold, to act wisely, to serve others, and follow what you have for our lives, or we can reject it, walk away, not listen to what you have for us. I pray that you allow us to change our hearts if that is the case. Allow us to boldly seek you, seek community. Allow us to be a voice for those who are unheard. Allow us to emulate what Esther did for the Jewish people 2,500 years ago. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.